Hi, everybody. I'm Gary Sassaman, the curatorial director of the Comic-Con Museum, and also the director of print and digital media for Comic-Con, which is a fancy way of saying I'm in charge of our publications and our website. But today I'm wearing my official WonderCon cap because I'm talking to one of our WonderCon 2020 special guests, Michael Cho, who is in Toronto right now. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Gary. Hey, everybody. I'm happy to be here. I'm sure we're all locked down and trying to stay safe, so I'm happy to participate and kill a few hours.
So, Mike being an artist, we're going to want to show as much art as possible today, but we have a couple of questions to start off with. So, Mike, when did art start for you? Were you drawing from an early age, or did you start drawing after you discovered comics?
No, I was one of those kids that was drawing since I was old enough to be able to hold a pencil in my hand. So my mom always remembers that I drew on all sorts of surfaces. And this is when I was growing up in South Korea, and life was very different back then to the South Korea of now, which is very high tech. We were still in a developing country, and I vividly remember when I was about 3 years old, my mom going to the corner store and buying 11 sheets of paper for a penny, for me to draw on it. I would draw on both sides. And I remember also around when I was 4 or 5, I entered a little art contest in the back of a Korean mana magazine, which is our kind of manga. And it was like, if you can trace this robot, you may win a prize. And so I did it, and I sent it in, and I got 3rd place, and which was huge. And they sent me this giant packet of paper toys. It was like this thick, an envelope this thick, and you open it up, and there was like an origami soccer game. There was a paper robot you could fold and things like that. And I think that set my career path, because I was like, I'm going to do this.
So when did you move to, did you move directly from South Korea to Canada, or were you in the United States first?
No, we moved to Canada, and then we went all around the eastern seaboard, which is the Maritimes, we call it, but that would be like New England and that area to you guys in the U.S. So we moved all around there when I was about 6, and then we finally settled in Ontario when I was about 7 and a half, and I've been here ever since.
When did you first discover comics?
This is a mind-blowing experience for me, because when I was 7 and we finally settled in Ontario, my parents ran a variety store, like a lot of Koreans in Canada at the time. And one of the best things about the variety store, other than like chips and chocolate, was the fact that they had a spinner rack. And the spinner rack, I mean, this just dates me, right? Because nobody has a spinner rack anymore unless you're a collector and you have one in your house, right? But a spinner rack was where they sold comics before they had comic shops, and they were sold at drugstores and variety stores. And being the owners of the variety store, they would get new shipments of comics every couple of weeks or something from the distributor. So my parents let me read them and keep the ones that I really liked, because they were just trying to encourage me to learn English or something. So that's about when I discovered it, and it was a nice way to get over the loneliness and the culture shock of being a new immigrant to the country, because I read comics when I was in Korea, and to find the same thing here, but with just different characters, was a real comfort to me.
So who were some of the characters you looked forward to each month?
Iron Man, 100%. That was my guy, I have a huge fondness for the David Michelin, John Romita, Bob Layton era of Iron Man, because those were the first comics I read. I could still identify the Claremont Byrne, Dave Cockrum kind of X-Men era by like a corner of the cover, because I read those to death. So I was a Marvel guy like really early, and I also read the other series of comics that I really loved were in the 80s. They put out reprints of Ditko Spider-Man in Marvel Tales, and I thought those were just the most perfect comics I'd ever read. So those were the early ones: Spider-Man, X-Men, Iron Man.
So how did your comics reading inform your art? Who do you look at as major influences on your
Uh,
style?
Major influences wise, like I went through the whole gamut of comics. I'm like that typical artistic kid who gravitated to comics early and then followed it all through their life. So when I was a kid, I read like superhero comics, and then as I turned into a surly teenager, I read a lot of indie comics and dark, gritty comics. And then I went to art college and sort of forgot about comics for a while, and then got back to it when I came out of art school. So when I was really taking art seriously, it was a different set of influences than when I was a kid. Like when I was a kid, all I wanted to be was John Byrne. Like
Mhm.
I could copy a signature. I wanted to ink like Terry Austin. I wanted to draw metal like Bob Layton did. But when I became a professional, like practicing artist who was actually getting paid for this stuff, what I really gravitated to was seeking out the original guys. So the guys that influenced the guys that I liked when I was a kid.
Mhm.
And that was sort of my path. And so at the bedrock, I love the adventure strip artists of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So my major influences would be like guys like Noel Sickles, Milt Caniff, Roy Crane was a huge one. Frank Robbins was fantastic, and then the golden age comic book artists, like my all-time favorite mainstream comic artist is Jack Kirby,
Mhm.
and I just love his work to death. I also love Wally Wood. I love the EC guys like John Severn and Will Elder, and I like the new school guys. Or actually, these guys be considered old now too. But I love David Mazzucchelli. I love Dan Klaus. I love Jaime Hernandez. My buddy Darwin Cook, who passed away, was a huge
Yeah.
influence on me. I love Japanese artists like Yoshihiro Tatsumi. You name it.
I think your style really is economical, and I don't mean that as an insult. It's like you're boiling everything down to its most essential elements, which really does remind me of Noel Sickles and Milton Caniff and even Chester Gould to a certain extent. All the storytelling is there, but it's very, very simple and it's very graphic. And those newspaper artists had to work that way because they were given such a small canvas to work on every day. But I definitely see Kirby. I definitely see Darwin in your work, and I see a little bit of Ditko, I think, and a little bit of Bruce Timm maybe too.
Mm. I don't think I have any Bruce Timm in me. Um, but I love Bruce Timm's work. But the strip artists are definitely, like that you mentioned, are definitely influences. Chester Gould less so. I'm familiar with his work. It's not really internalized in me, but I'm sure he influenced a lot of people who, that influenced me.
Right.
Right. So, but when you talk about boiling stuff down to the essence, that's kind of where I was coming from. My thing for me has always been like there's sort of an overarching philosophy of things without getting pretentious. One time I had a friend of mine ask me, if you can draw in all different styles, and you're capable of drawing in like one way and another way, how do you pick what way to draw something?
Mm.
Right. And I always said at that point, that's when your philosophy of art, what do you actually champion? What is most valuable to you? And for me, it was always, I always liked things that were stripped down. I always like trying to get to the essence of something. I wanted to take stuff out rather than put more stuff in.
Mhm.
And I always thought clarity was important, but at the same time, clarity mixed with inspiration gave, there was a sense of art, there was artistry in that. It wasn't a schematic. If you could strip something down to its essence and make those little bits sing, there was a great artistry in that. And that sort of informs a lot of what I like. Like I always tell people, I like music, for example, that doesn't have too much production. I like it raw.
Mhm.
I like concert recordings. I like the demo that someone made in their kitchen with just their acoustic guitar rather than the studio version with the full band.
Mhm.
And when ever I'm doing artwork, I actually I told a friend of mine that I actually schedule time to take stuff out of the drawing. Like
Hmm.
I'll do something and then I actually budget a little bit of time during the deadline to sit there for a couple hours going, okay, how much can I take out, before this thing falls apart? And I find that the doing something that has fewer elements leaves more room for the viewer to bring in their own imagination to something.
Hmm.
I used to describe it as if you draw Times Square and you draw every car and every license plate and every window and everything, every brick on a building, it's never as good and as motivating and inspiring as suggesting Times Square, through a series of brushstrokes and such, and then letting the viewer fill in the rest with their mind. So as a result, I've always followed that philosophy.
So I first discovered your work. I think we met in 2012 at a convention, but I first discovered your work in 2009 in this magazine,
Yeah.
Illo, which was put out by the people that do a wonderful magazine about the golden age of illustration called Illustration. And I immediately fell in love with your style of art and your limited palettes and everything else. And I remember meeting you in 2012, I think, and talking to you about the possibility of maybe doing a souvenir book cover at some point in time. But between then, 2009 and 2012, you came out with a book with Drawn and Quarterly that was basically not comics. It was more illustration, and it was basically back alleys in your neighborhood in Toronto. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that, because I was thrilled to find that book, because there weren't no other books by you that I knew of. I think you were concentrating mainly on illustration at that point in time. So we're going to try and share a screen here so we can look at some of these images, and we're going to warn you that both of us are technologically challenged, but we're going to try our best. So let's go ahead and share the screen, Mike, and see what
All
pops
right.
up.
I got to try and share the screen because I am terrible at computers. But okay, so let's go through some slides. Can you see me here? This is the cover for my Back
Yeah.
Alleys book. Yeah, this is the book you're referring to. And this was a book that came out through Drawn and Quarterly. And the reason I did this book was because the impetus for it was that like a lot of artists, when I came out of art college, I had some holes in my knowledge. And one of the things was that I focused on figures and didn't know how to draw environments at all. Right. I mean, like when you asked me to draw a building, I would draw you that comic book building of a box with a crossword puzzle windows.
Mhm.
And I realized that I had to fix that hole in my knowledge. So what I thought I'd do was I would try and learn how to draw landscapes, but I lived in a city, and therefore there weren't, rolling hills. So I tried to draw what I was familiar with, which was aspects of the city that I knew, which were interesting, which were the organic parts of the city. And those were the back alleys. So I drew things like this, where I would go around my neighborhood, and occasionally I would sketch things on the spot, and then they got more elaborate, and I started taking notes and taking photographs and doing things in the studio instead. And after about 5 years of these, I decided to collect them into a book, and thankfully Drawn and Quarterly was very interested in it, and they put it out. And it's been nice because, first of all, it was a labor of love, but I always get feedback from other artists and people who discovered me through this book.
Yeah, I think one of the things, maybe unshare your screen.
Oh, yeah.
We'll go back into people mode.
Check.
I think one of the things that was interesting about that is your limited palette on some of those images, and which of course carries over into your other art. What was your first published illustration work?
Okay. I was in my 20s, and I had a neighbor of mine who lived in the same warehouse apartment building as me, and he was a TV and film director, and he put out an autobiography, a book called Use Once and Destroy. And he asked me if I was an illustrator, and because I'm broke, and I was at the time a fine artist. I was like, yeah, I can draw this stuff for your book. So I sat and drew like 50 drawings for this book, and that was technically my first published illustration. After that, I did a few small magazine jobs for companies in Toronto, like because Toronto's a publishing hub in Canada. And was paid a pittance. So that was technically my first published stuff.
Mm-hmm. And in comics, was Batman black and white your first?
No, believe it or not, I broke into comics drawing for children's magazines.
Okay.
Because in Canada, there was a very good magazine called Owl Magazine. And if you're a Canadian of a certain age, you remember it because it was in every library, and the circulation numbers were very, very high. It's still going to this day, but I used to draw little spot illustrations for them and like 2-page puzzle spreads when I was in my 20s. And then one time they were starting a comic feature, and it was going to be 4 pages of like a kid's detective comic that was like Encyclopedia Brown. And they had this artist, but he was struggling with doing the layouts, and so they asked me, hey, would you mind doing some layouts to show this guy how to draw comics, because you have a comic style. And so I did, and then he quit, and then they offered me the gig, and I said, sure, I'll do it. And then that's how I started drawing comics. So for about 3 or 4 years, I drew a children's comic in Owl Magazine. And it's funny because I still run into fans to this day who found me that way. And like years ago when I started doing conventions, the fans would be like 10 years old. And now every once in a while I do a talk at a university and somebody will raise their hand and go like, did you draw that Owl comic? And I was like, oh my God, now they're like 25. Okay.
Yeah. So let's look at some of your comic art. Let's start with some of the stuff you've done recently for DC. And what we're going to do is look at art from DC and Marvel, and then some of Mike's illustration art, and then also we're going to go through the process for one of his Batwoman covers. So
Cool.
This is Action Comics 1000. You and I have discussed this before when we were working on the cover for the WonderCon 2017 program book, and you have a style that lends itself to being interpreted as retro. And I know you do a lot of contemporary illustration and stuff like that, but this is definitely a 1940s cover.
Yeah. And it's deliberately so. They asked me to do, like Action Comics 1000 had, I think, 8 different covers because they were divided by year. Actually, there were way more than that if you count the retailer variants and such. Yeah. But the main covers, there were 8 of them, and they assigned each artist a cover based on a decade. And so they gave me the 1940s decade. And, that's the easiest one in the world. I mean, when I got the call, I was like, okay, so I'm just going to draw Superman fighting Nazis, right? So it's like, you can come up with an idea like that, lickety split. But it's retro because it's deliberately retro. I don't mind the tag because a lot of my influences are old school. I tend to view them as classic comics rather than retro. But depending on the assignment, I will go full retro because the project demands it, or that I will do something contemporary. So I can flip between both areas, but my stuff still retains a lot of the influences that are from the past.
Right. So let's I think the next one is your recent Detective Comics 1000.
Yeah, and this one's hardcore retro. I mean, I deliberately designed this to be a 1950s Batman comic.
Yeah.
When they assigned me this,
the Bat Baby is even included.
Oh yeah. When they assigned me this one, I thought they would give me the 40s Batman cover, and I was like, I want to do 40s Batman or 30s Batman. That would be dope. And then they said 1950s Batman, and I was like, that's the era of all those weird Batman like costumes, and and he's like zebra Batman, and I was like, oh wait, I'll just draw all of those. So I sat there and researched for like 2 days, compiling all the various transformations of Batman and characters I wasn't even aware of, like Scottish Batman, and I just knew I wanted to put Scuba Batman in there, and I didn't know who Bat Baby was, you know.
Yeah,
And
Bat Baby is one of those moments in Batman comics.
yeah,
You know.
and I try to draw it like, you know, Shelley Moldoff had drawn it or something.
Yeah, yeah. I see a little bit of Dick Sprang in there though.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Dick,
He's
Dick,
a like, yeah. Again, you know, that's a big influence on the Batman
right.
stuff. You know,
Yeah. Okay, what's next? Oh, I love
this
this
is
cover.
this was one of my favorites. For I did a long run of covers for the collections of Silver Age and Golden Age DC comics.
Mhm.
So this one was a cover for the Adam Strange collection from the 60s. But unfortunately, this is the one that hasn't been published. It's my favorite of the whole
Mhm.
batch of the early covers that I did. I did like 20 of those, and this is the only one that never got published. So, and I was saddened because Adam Strange is one of my favorite characters in DC, and I got a chance to draw him, but never got published.
Are you following the new Adam Strange, the Strange Adventures miniseries?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Rich,
and great
Mitch
creative team
Garrett's
on that. Yeah, yeah.
and Doc Shaner.
Yeah, yeah, he's great too. You
Yeah,
know, that whole creative team is fantastic. So
yeah. Okay. What we have
this
next here?
this is a page from
Oh, yeah.
Batman Black and White, which was a story I did. I think it was for issue 1 of the relaunch of Batman, the latest relaunch. I think it was probably 2013 or 2012. And this came about because Mark Chiarello, then the art director editor of that series, contacted me one day, and he said, "Hey, would you like to write and draw a Batman story?" And I said no, because I thought he was asking me for, at the time I was doing a lot of really quick assignments, and I thought that he was asking me to do a quick fill-in, and I was like, I don't have the time, you know.
Hmm.
So I turned him down, and also I didn't want to draw a Batman story because I thought that my favorite Batman artist was David Mazzucchelli, and I thought that he drew just the perfect Batman, and so I didn't think I could add anything to that. I thought I would just rip off what he had drawn, and I didn't want to do that. And then one time, then he called me back like a month later and said, "Hey, if Chip Kidd writes this, would you draw it? Because he's asked for you." And I said, "Yeah, I would. What is this for?" And he said, "It's for Batman Black and White." And I said, "If you told me it was for Batman Black and White, I would have said no, yes, right away." You know.
Hmm.
So Chip wrote a great story that featured Robin, who is my favorite character in Batman. You know, the Dick Grayson Robin, and it featured Superman, and so and it was a great opportunity to collaborate, and we've been friends ever since.
So even though this is in two colors, black and orange, it was reproduced in black and white, right?
Yeah, we all cheated. Like I cheated on this because I drew this with Dr. Martin inks in orange and then converted it to gray. And when I saw that first issue of Batman Black and White, it's supposed to be Batman Black and White, and I noticed that everybody except Chris Samnee cheated and put down tones or something, you know.
Mhm.
And I was like, okay, so I'm not the only one who cheated on this.
What do we have next in the DCQ here?
This is a variant cover I did for Cave
Yeah.
Carson Has a Cybernetic Eye, which is a great series. I knew nothing about Cave Carson or the series when I was assigned this, and then when I read it, I was like, oh, this is fantastic. You know, the art team and the writing was just bananas. It was so fun to do, and they gave me carte blanche to do what I wanted. And I noticed that all the other previous covers were kind of psychedelic, so I sort of leaned heavy on that. And I asked them if I could do my own lettering for this, so that I can integrate the lettering with the cover. And so this was a fun one as well.
Yeah, I love that lettering. It's very evocative of like um, concert posters from the
Yeah,
70s.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The 60s concert posters from California, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of the look, except I put like a more tech spin on some of it.
Hmm.
This is a cover for the second volume of the 1970s Shazam stories from DC. It's a hardcover. And I did the cover for volume 1, which was and that book sold really well. So they asked me to do the second one. And since the first cover was set at night, I thought I'd do a daytime scene.
Hmm.
And it was a really good opportunity to go back and draw one of my favorite characters from my childhood as well, which is, you know, Captain Marvel, Shazam. I remember gravitating to that character very early because he had big fat outlines, and the
Hmm.
CC Beck style is like it's the most friendly thing for me when I was a kid. It was, fat outlines, big lightning bolt on his chest. He's a kid that turns into a superhero. I mean, you couldn't ask for more. So I wanted to try and inject a little bit of that feeling of optimism and hope, and bring that out in the cover.
You even got Uncle Marvel in there too.
Yeah, that was what I definitely wanted to fit in. Dudley was what I wanted to fit in. I wanted to fit Junior in with his Elvis hairdo, and Mary Marvel, and make it a fun, sort of inspiring scene of them flying through the clouds.
Mm-hmm. Is there one more DC, or are we moving on to Marvel here?
No, yeah, we'll just go on to the Marvel ones, I think.
Yeah.
So this is for Civil War II, where they asked me to draw covers for all 8 issues. And it was Tom Brevoort, who the editor-in-chief there, who assigned this to me. And Tom is really great. He's whenever I get something from him, he either gives me full direction to do what I want, or he gives me inspiration with an idea that makes perfect sense immediately. And in this case, he said, hey, we're going to do covers for Civil War II. I want you to think fight posters. And I was like, oh, that's perfect. You say no more. And so I just researched a bunch of fight posters, and then came up with covers that try to evoke the look of classic, marquee cards. And this one's particularly interesting to me because my wife is a graphic designer and an illustrator. Her name is Claudia Davila, and she helped me lay out the typefaces on this stuff so that I would rough it out in pencil, then she would pick all the fonts, and and we would discuss and tweak things. So I asked if she could get credit on the cover. Because she did half the work, and Marvel was fine with that. So it's an opportunity for us to have our names on a Marvel comic, and so it was fun because of that. So here's another one, and this one was my favorite of the batch, which really evokes a classic boxing poster, and again, our names are on it. Plus, it has an undercard with Captain America and Spider-Man and stuff like that, and has little touches like general admission and every seat is guaranteed, no home TV, things like that. Shall we move on?
Yeah.
Okay, so this was a cover for a variant cover for a reissue of Marvels, the great Alex Ross and Kurt Busiek series. That was something that was a big inspiration to me in my 20s when I saw it. It was mind-blowing. And they asked me to do the second issue's variant cover, which was set in the Silver Age. And I asked them, oh, great, this is an opportunity to draw the FF. And they said, yeah, totally draw the FF. So I thought I'd take a crack at trying to draw them right after their rocket ship crashed, and with the early lumpy version of the thing. So that was one of those bucket list things I got to check off. I'm currently doing a bunch of FF-based covers for another Marvel project, but this was the first attempt at it for Marvel in print. This was a deliberately, hilariously 70s retro cover for Chips Zdarsky's, and I think it's Mark Bagley who did the interior art for the Spider-Man Life Story 2. And again, when I was assigned, they said, just do a 70s cover. And I leaned hard into that. And so it practically looks like it has nicotine stains, and the rainbow effect here. So, and again, my wife helped me out with the lettering here, so it's got a very Soul Train kind of vibe to it.
That cover is interesting to me because I don't think until you sent me some images today I'd ever seen it before, and without noticing the signature right away, I may not have guessed that was by you.
Yeah.
But it's so 70-ish. Who do you think major influences on that?
It's Bob Peak. It's Bob Peak all the way. That's I sometimes like to try out different styles because I don't like to reject anything. For years I worked without line art, and I thought that line art was kind of not the direction I wanted to go in. I wanted to go into to do work that was based on light and shadow. And then I thought that as I got older, I realized, I should never write off anything, any venue or avenue of art. And so I start researching and learn to love things that I rejected earlier. And it's the same thing with styles. I try out all sorts of different styles and try to figure out, how they work, what was the mindset of the artist, what makes this effective, and then try to bring some of that back into my own work. But when they ask me to do a deliberately 70s cover, I'm going to lean into that as heavily as I can.
Mm-hmm.
This is a page from X-Men First Class, which was a comic that was, I guess that's what inspired the movie. Jeff Parker wrote this story, and he was great. And it was a short story that was based on 50s sci-fi movies, and this one in particular was based on the day the Earth stood still. Jeff was great to work with. He was he did it kind of like the way Archie Goodwin used to do it in the past, where he just said, "What do you like to draw?" And so I gave him a bunch of notes. He wrote a story based on it.
So on something like this, I mean, was that the final form that it was printed in?
Well, without the panel borders and Marvel information, yeah,
right,
this is the final form that it was printed in. It was drawn using markers and ink, so the tone was on the board. It was not done digitally.
How much are you splitting work now between digitally and traditional? Or does it depend on the project?
It depends on the project, but I hate to say it because my art rep just wishes I would do everything on the board. But I would say I do about 60% digitally now, because sometimes the deadlines are just too fast. So therefore, and I have to, put out a volume of this stuff. So I'd rather do it digitally if the time crunch is tight. That FF cover that I showed earlier with I was originally going to paint that in gouache, but then I messed it up after a day of work, and I realized, oh crap, I don't have enough time to do this thing if I screw up again. So I just switched it and did it all traditionally. But sometimes I'll do digital stuff just because the fact I can relax doing it, because there's an undo, something that you don't get when you're painting. And digital work allows me to experiment more because of that. So I can take bigger risks knowing that if I screw up, I can just erase that part. But there's other projects where I just really want to paint it and love the feel of, dragging a brush across the paper. And whenever I do that after a long period where I'm doing digital stuff, if I go back to traditional work, I remember, this is what got me loving drawing in the first place. This is one of a bunch of covers I did for Marvel. They were, I think, Axel Alonso and Tom Brevoort asked me to do a month of variant covers across the entire line. So they assigned me initially 25 covers, and I tapped out at 21. And they said, it's just variant covers. That's your signature style. And when I sent in my initial sketches, Tom Brevoort, again, being fantastic, was like, no, stop trying to Marvel covers. Just do your thing. And he said, and I said, well, I'm leaving room for the logo and the trade dress. And he said, no, you create your own if you want. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. So you're giving me, carte blanche to do what I want. And I've learned over the years, whenever someone gives you power and control over your own work, don't hand it back. So I lean really hard into it, and I try to just design these as signature images that show off the heroes. Of the 21 covers, I'm always surprised to find where they ended up, because they went into Marvel's licensing system, and they ended up on T-shirts, on posters, phone cases.
Some of the T-shirts I've seen based on these are really interesting, because they're like full bleed T-shirts.
Yeah. I've seen that, and then 4 of them got turned into dessert plates. I saw that so you could eat off of Ant-Man, and then recently I saw photos where the Marvel Hotel in Euro Disney the New York hotel that's inside the Euro Disney has a lot of this stuff as the room decor.
Wow.
So yeah, so it's funny to see where it all ended up. But for me, it was just 3 months of doing whatever the heck I wanted. And so it was one of the most fun assignments I had, because all I did for 3 months was just, draw covers based on A-list Marvel heroes that I always wanted to draw, and with no worry about whether or not the images I drew conform to a storyline or anything like that.
Mhm.
So it was a ton of fun.
Now, were these done digitally, or were they done on board?
About half of them were done on board, about half of them were done digitally, and some were done in a mix. For
Mhm.
example, this Scarlet Witch one was done all on the board, but the headdress was added digitally. This Captain Marvel one was done all on the board, except it was all in one single color, and then I changed some of the colors around
Mhm.
digitally. This Howard the Duck is 100% digital. This Spider-Man is 100% on the board, except for the webbing, which would have been a nightmare to draw
Right.
in ink. And I'm trying to find one here. This one is all on board, and this Daredevil is 100% on the board. So it
Okay.
all varies, but I try to treat digital work as not a specific genre on its own, but just one more tool in the toolbox.
Right.
I like to go back and forth, and every tool has advantages and disadvantages, and I don't write off anything
I
like
think there's a
some people.
little bit of a lag with the images, so it kind of skipped over Daredevil. If you
Oh,
want to
sorry,
go back to that and
hang on.
freeze on that for a second, so people can see it a little better.
This was the Daredevil one that I did
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
the. So the only thing that's digital really on this is the lettering.
Hmm.
So uh, and years later, I did a panel about comic covers, and Bob Layton was pointing out you could never get away with any of what you did in those covers in the 80s.
Yeah.
The idea of redrawing the trade dress, the logo, or putting it at the bottom, and not tying it into a story. I mean, those were like, impossible to get approved back in the
Hmm.
80s. And I was like, I'm so glad I live in this era where you get a lot more freedom.
Hmm.
So moving onward, I guess, should we talk about process or something, or?
I thought the next thing was we were going to look a little bit at your illustration work. Is that next?
Oh,
You have in the queue here?
yeah, hang on a second. Let me just, let me find,
Or do you want to do the Batwoman cover? Because we're coming up on, we got about a little over 20 minutes left, I think.
yeah, do you want to talk about illustration work then?
Yeah,
I can,
let's look through some of your illustration work
all
because I
right.
think it shows, really the variety of different things that you do. So,
Yeah, because I started out in illustration long before I did comics. So I was drawing children's books and such, and then I was always doing editorial illustration. So these are some examples of some of my editorial illustrations. This is a spot illustration portrait of Beyonce. I do a lot of portraits these days for Forbes magazine. It was highlighting various important women. This is an illustration I did for the New Yorker to accompany an article on the development of Taylor Swift's career. So I got to draw her
she
in
looks
a
a
very.
little bit like a superhero up there in the corner,
Yeah,
on the
the
right
idea
side.
here being, it's again, conceptually, the idea is that she's tearing away parts of her persona to reveal hidden sides,
Hmm.
and the one at the top corner here is just her in an outfit that's from a music video where she's glammed up in a kind of a pseudo superhero outfit. So, it was about her maturing and revealing different sides of her personality rather than the initial one, which was established during her teenage years.
Hmm.
This was a book cover for a young adult sports biography series. This one in particular had to do with Drew Brees, who I knew nothing about because I know nothing about football. But it was fun to do an assignment like this. I did Babe Ruth, Blake Griffin, I think Mia Hamm and Drew Brees for this series.
You've done a lot of sports-oriented stuff, though, haven't you? Especially like basketball stuff.
I'm a huge basketball fan, and I would love to do more Sports Illustrated stuff about basketball, but that's about it for the sports. Like when I was drawing this, I didn't even know how a football helmet should look, so I had to research that, you know?
Mhm.
So yeah, but I've done the occasional sports-related assignment for like ESPN magazine or things like that, but
Mhm.
not a large enough to collect in print. What I do is I doodle a lot of basketball people
Mhm.
when I'm sitting, you know, in watching TV. I'll draw a picture of what I'm watching, and often it's a basketball game. So
So
it
I follow you on Instagram, and occasionally you put up sketchbook pages and that. Have you ever thought about publishing your sketchbooks?
yeah, I have, but the I get asked that a lot. But the problem right now, man, is like it's time. You know,
Yeah,
you gotta you gotta cull all these images and you gotta put them together and put them in a book. And I'm always just fighting another deadline. You know,
right.
raising two kids and fighting a deadline. The thing most people want is a art book of my superhero work for the
Mhm.
comic companies, and I think that would sell well. But the problem there is clearances. So it would have to be approved by Marvel and DC, and you couldn't combine the two together. So,
Yeah,
you know,
Marvel is
it's
currently doing something like that. I think they've done one on like J. Scott Campbell and I think there might be a Frank Cho one and stuff in the works. So um, I could definitely see you doing Marvel doing a book of all your covers and stuff like that. You know,
yeah, that would be fun. You know, I would love to do one like that. Just as long as I don't have to put too much of it
right,
together myself. You know,
right.
like a lot of people, I'm always, you know, too busy working and moving forward than to collect and, you know, prepare a retrospective
Right.
of past stuff.
So we were going to take one cover and go through the process of creating it, and I think we picked a Batwoman cover that you did recently for DC.
Hmm. Shall I show you those?
Yeah, let's look at those.
Okay. Um, so what happened was that I was assigned to do some variant covers for Batwoman, and I did sort of like a year-long run. I think I did about maybe 14 covers or 12 covers all in all. And invariably, a lot of these are done before the script is finalized. So all I'll have is a synopsis, but sometimes it'll be a very detailed synopsis. And for this particular assignment, what they assigned me was an issue, and they said the villain is Professor Pig, and she confronts him, you know, in a moment, in a sort of she's captured by him, and he threatens her. So I was trying to research what would be an iconic simple image, and I settled on the meat cleaver because that's sort of a trademark of his.
Mhm.
And so I was trying to come up with ideas, and what I normally do is I take the trade dress so that I'm always aware of how much space I have for the drawing,
Right.
and I try to draw on top of that. And in this case, I was trying to come up with images quickly. And sometimes, if it's going to be a simple and iconic one, I'm trying to balance the colors as well as the composition and the figures. So I'll draw quick thumbnails. This will be like 20 minutes, maybe, you know,
Mhm.
and see if the idea works. And so this was the very first thumbnail I came up with, which is her image on a cleaver. It didn't work. So therefore, I tried a different one where I was like, okay, I'm going to put a hand holding that cleaver and maybe make her injured and angry or something, and try and see if I can salvage this idea. Again, it did not work. So I was like, okay, fine. I'm going to have to come up with different ideas. So I was like, okay, well, she's injured, and I could position her among giant cleavers as a small way of showing her in peril, you know. And I was like, oh, there's a lot of dead white space on this thing, so it's not really working for me. And at this point, I'm starting to hit panic because what I'm not showing you is about 5 or 6 different variations on each idea with different images inset inside the reflections of the cleavers and such. So I'm like, none of these ideas are working. So now I'm just, you know, free associating. And I came up with this, which is unreadable to anyone except me, it seems like,
Mhm.
but she's sort of moving and there's a bunch of cleavers and kitchen knives being thrown at her. And I thought, okay, there's something here. I can probably do something with this. This is a lot rougher as a drawing than this, but it's easy enough for me to parse. And I was thinking, okay, so this idea kind of works. I can make something out of this. So I drew up a pencil sketch around this, which looks like this. But having already an idea of the color and the balance of black and red in the image, I was able to just come up with a pencil rough, and I thought this works. So I submitted it, and DC approved it. So after that stage, after the rough is approved, I go on and do final pencils, which look like this. And the final pencils for this cover were drawn digitally because I like to be able to reposition elements and such. So I find that drawing it, the pencils digitally often works best for me. And you could see that there's gray areas here because I'm getting very, very tight with the pencils. I don't often get this tight, but I just wanted to make sure that I rendered this properly in ink when I inked it, because there was so many elements in this cover that I didn't want to botch it and have to restart. So I take this cover and I printed out this image, and I printed out onto Bristol board, which is, you know, twice up, or 1.5 size for comics. And then I paint on top of it in ink and Dr. Martin dyes, and it makes an image that looks like this. So all the red is on the board, all the black is on the board. There's a little bit of soft shading with charcoal here, or grease pencil, and a lot of dry brush effect. And this is what it looks like on the board when I scan it. After I scan it, then I tweak the colors, and I balance the blacks. I make little corrections here and there if needed digitally, and it ends up with an image like this. And as you can see here, I've added some airbrushy effect that I can't do because I don't know how to use an airbrush. So
Okay.
I did it digitally, and I added it there. And that's the final cover that gets sent to DC. And then they add the trade dress. But I already know how much room is needed for that trade dress because
Right.
I've already calculated it. So you know, it's already been established as part of the design, and then it gets printed.
Mm-hmm. So,
And so that's how the sausage is made.
um, so we talked a little bit before we started recording here about conventions and how the world has changed this year. We just announced today that Comic-Con will be postponed into 2021, and WonderCon, which was supposed to be last weekend, of which you were going to be a guest of, was also postponed to 2021. What do you enjoy most about going to conventions?
Conventions are enjoyable in so many different ways. Number one is getting out of the house, because as a freelancer with deadlines, I'm trapped indoors a lot of the time, and always looking at a board or a screen and just working nonstop. So when you go to a convention, that ends, and you're suddenly at a hotel and you're going out for dinner a lot, and that's great. I also enjoy seeing my friends from all around the world, other fellow artists and creators that I only get to see at conventions because they're in the exact same boat as me, where they never get out of the house. You know, I have friends, for example, in Toronto. There's a huge comic creator community here. I have friends who live 3 blocks away, you know, and I never see them except when we're at WonderCon or in Seattle or New York. And we always joke about that, how we always talk about we should go for coffee sometime or come over, and we never have to because we're always juggling deadlines. So we always end up meeting and having dinner in another city, you know, even though we live a couple blocks away. And then thirdly, I love meeting fans and having genuine interaction with the people who are appreciating the comics. All the fans I've met have always been super appreciative, and it makes me understand part of why I do this. You know, I do this for artistic fulfillment, but the other side is that it creates joy for other people. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and that is incredibly inspiring, and I'm very lucky to have a career where I get to have that impact on people.
Do people come up to you that are artists and they want your advice or they want you to look at their portfolios and stuff?
Yeah,
Mention
yeah.
it?
Every once in a while, I get that. Sometimes it's a young, like sometimes it's like a 10-year-old kid, and that's fantastic, you know. And then sometimes it's a person who's graduated art college and is seriously contemplating being a comic book artist.
What kind of advice would you give to someone who wants to break into comics?
The That's kind of tricky because there's two venues. Like there are people who just I give advice to people who just want to create comics, and then there's people who want to work for a comic company and draw that company's IP. You know,
Mhm.
they want to break in and they want to make Spider-Man comics. They want to draw Spider-Man comics, or they want advice on how they can have a career doing their own thing.
Mhm.
You know, and for people who are wanting to draw Spider-Man comics or Batman comics or whatever, or work for Marvel or DC or Dark Horse, I always tell them, number one, be professional. Always be aware of the fact that you have to be nice to people, present yourself in a professional manner, have a business card, don't insult other creators online, things like that, and
Mhm.
just carry yourself in a professional manner. Like if you're writing an email to a comic company, don't write "Sup, Dark Horse." You should learn how to deal with people as a professional. Act like and then the second part of that is attend a lot of conventions, do a lot of portfolio reviews, and take criticism.
Right.
There's a lot of people who have a difficulty of accepting criticism, but criticism isn't a personal attack. It's meant to be helping you get to the next level. They offer you critiques to help you become better, not to cut you down.
Right.
And you have to accept it that way. And the ones that I find are really successful, the ones that I've talked to, are the ones that take it that way. And so they go to a portfolio review with their samples, and the editor there gives them a bunch of notes, and they actually go home and do that. They
Mhm.
follow those notes and correct things, and then they come back the next time, and that editor remembers them, and
Right.
says, okay, this guy's serious. He tried. He's actually trying to improve. He's not there yet, but he or she is moving forward. And then the next time they come back, they go, okay, you know what, she's really good. She's now at this point where I can throw her an assignment.
Mhm.
So that's what I would give as advice to people who are trying to work for the companies. And then for people who are trying to just create comics, I would just tell them, keep just there's so many venues now to get your work out there. All you have to do is just create comics. If you are someone who is trying to make your own graphic novel, or your own self-published comic, you can do it a web comic format. You can, put it on Instagram, and you can self-publish things on demand. So there's so many other venues now that to get your creation out there and tell your story, that I would just tell them to make comics, and eventually you will make a following. There will be people who are looking for what your unique voice is, and they'll gravitate to you and follow you along as you move up, and go from your little web comic with 200 people looking at it to eventually 40,000 people looking at it, and a volume of it coming out in self-publishing, and then later on you're putting out a hardcover collection of that.
Right. So speaking of following, where can people follow you on social media and on the internet?
Um, the oldest and old schoolest way of following me is just going to my website, www.michaelcho.com. It's just a blog that has all my work on it. But that's boring, and you don't want to do that. So I recommend people follow me on Instagram, because that's where I post a lot of my artwork. Some of my posts are like process stuff, sketches, and things like that. And that's my handle is Michael_Cho_art. But if that's all confusing, just Google Michael Cho and you'll see my face. If you search Michael Cho on Instagram, you'll see my face and click on that icon. And then the third method is Twitter. But I don't recommend people find me on Twitter, because Twitter's just it's a time suck, and quite frankly, I'm sick of it. You know, it's too many trolls, and not a platform that is conducive to real interaction with people, it seems like. So I try to wean people off Twitter, and I only keep it up for promotion because I have to.
And then you do have an original art sales agent, Albert
Yes,
Moore. So do you want to
yes.
mention his website, because there is some art up there, I think, that's for sale.
Yes, yes, you can find me out at www.albertmoy.com. He is my art rep. He reps me, Jim Lee, John Cassaday, Jay Lee, Liam Sharp, and a bunch of other people. And you can find all the pages that I did on paper on there, but you will not find a single digital thing because that doesn't exist on paper.
So finally, we hear news about all this, the pandemic, from around the world, but I don't see a lot about Canada. So how are things going up there?
We're okay. Like everybody else in the entire world, we are all social distancing, and the numbers of cases in Canada are not that bad. I think we have somewhere, as of today, we have somewhere around just over 20,000 cases. And I live in Toronto, where we have a decent sizable amount of cases, but we're all social distancing. All the schools are closed. All the shops except essential services are closed. And just to give you an idea of what it's like in Canada, one time there was a supermarket this week that reported that they were left open accidentally overnight. And when it was reported in the news that people went into the supermarket in the next day thinking that it was open, and then picked out a bunch of items from the shelves, and then wrote down a little list of what they had taken and their phone number so that they can come back and pay, when called upon. So we're all doing fairly well. It keeps up our, Canadian politeness stereotype. But we have, for me, I have, my wife and I have our kids at home, and we're both working from home. And I know we're very blessed because even though it's a challenging time, we're all safe, and our kids are safe, and we're able to work from home.
Mike, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. We hope that we'll be able to see you next year at WonderCon. And I don't know the exact dates offhand, but it is the end of March 2021 in Anaheim again. We're very hopeful to be able to do a show then and have you along as a special guest.
I would love to go back to WonderCon. I had such a great time, and I was really looking forward to this year because
Yeah.
it's actually like one of my favorite cons. The crowds are crazy fun, and location is great, and I was super looking forward to it. So I would love to come back.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. And we're going to sign off here. And if you like this recording, let us know. You can go to www.comic-con.org, hit the contact button, and send us an email. And we'd appreciate your input. So for Comic-Con and WonderCon, I'm Gary Sassaman, signing off with the spotlight on Michael Cho, our WonderCon 2020 special guest. Thanks. Bye.